Right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this WHAM online program. Understanding the U.S. China conflict with our speaker, Sara Flounders. That's the event. When we scheduled this a few weeks ago, we, of course, had no idea what unprecedented times we'd be in and how important this event would be to our understanding of the U.S. China conflict. Thank you for joining us for this WHAM online program.
That was me. My you were happening on my page.
Oh, okay. All right. Everybody, bear with us, everybody, because this is our first time. For three of us, or two of us, it's our first time. First of all, thanks to Emma Fiala, it is not her first time. She is a WHAM member, co-chair, a WHAM co-chair, and a web person extraordinaire who has set this up and is doing the technical part. Also on the Skype are Meredith Abbey, wave to us, Meredith, who's a member of the Anti-War Committee, and Kim Franco, wave Kim, who is a member of WHAM, and I'm Sarah Martin, also a WHAM member. We want you to ask questions and give your comments, so post them on the stream, and we'll be monitoring them. Meredith and I will be monitoring them. But most of all, thanks so much to Sara Flounders, who is co-director of the IAC. She's been a tireless and well-known anti-war activist since the 60s. Her trips with Ramsey Clark to countries like Iraq and Yugoslavia at the height of those U.S. wars and their eyewitness accounts were invaluable to the work of the anti-war movement. She's an analyst, writer, and speaker, a frequent contributor to Workers' World newspaper and to RT, among others. Thanks so much for being with us, Sarah. And I'll start you off with, what is the difference in response of China and the U.S. to this pandemic?
Well, that's really the most basic question. Very good. And I think nothing shows in starker terms the difference between the response of a country that has a socialist base and a strong, 90 million strong Communist Party in China, and the complete chaos of capitalism here in the U.S. Literally the 2 months that the U.S. spent, and 2 months and more, ridiculing China in the most racist and disgusting ways, and making no preparations, even respirators, ventilators, any kind of a shutdown, despite World Health Organization warnings and daily warnings and measurements from China on the spread and the measures that they were taking. Now, how could it be that a developing country was able at the highest level to take extraordinary measures, building 1,000-bed and 1,600 bed specialized hospitals in 10 days' time. And during this same time, the U.S. was doing absolutely nothing. And as a matter of fact, I live here in Jersey City. The scandal was which of 3 additional hospitals was going to be closed over this mass privatization of medical care that is continuing. So the contrasts are enormous. I think what's also enormous is that China, for the first time, is showing what can and should be done. There is an extraordinary amount of just acceptable deaths from the flu virus every single year. 80,000 deaths in the U.S. in the year 2017-18, just from the flu. That was acceptable. And China has refused to make these measures acceptable and took extraordinary measures. And I think if they hadn't, the U.S. wouldn't be taking the measures that we're seeing today. Late, very, very unprepared, but at least finally ordering a shutdown and at least a discussion of some pay during this time and some freezes on mortgages and payments like that, no evictions during this time. But this comes because China made this a nationwide policy and publicized it around the world. That had never happened before. Not only a quarantine, but saying to the whole country, a complete freeze. on all bills, on credit cards, on mortgages, on rent during this special time. So the differences are stark, and we have to continue studying what China did in order to make real demands here.
Things even with all of that, of course, every time China's it's mentioned, China, it's always draconian measures that were taken, never that they were life-saving measures, but that they were draconian.
Right.
Why is the U.S. so antagonistic and so unwilling to or I'm sure they probably are looking at what's going on in China, but unwilling to publicly acknowledge what China has done?
Well, the conflict with China had been stepping up really since the Obama administration, what was called the pivot to Asia, which was how to realign U.S. military forces. Now 400 bases surrounding China, expanding conflict in the South China Sea, where the U.S. insists on sending destroyers, aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines into the region, and a nonstop propaganda wars, such an escalation of National Endowment for Democracy, NED type actions in Hong Kong, in Xinjiang, everything, and of course the trade war, which has gone on for the past year. Everything that could be done to slow down, to halt China's development was being done as an orchestrated, coordinated U.S. policy. You had the trade war at the same time as you had Hong Kong, as the same time that you had almost daily publicity claiming 1 million people were imprisoned in Xinjiang, and yet without any collaboration of these figures. So this was a propaganda war going on before the COVID-19 virus hit.
And why are we afraid of China? What kind of danger do they pose?
Well, the big there's a really good question. China is now the second largest economy in the world and the largest producer of goods. So this is a threat to U.S. dominance. China, through the Belt and Road program, it's a program unlike anything that the U.S. has ever offered or even has the capacity to offer. What the U.S. has to offer the entire world is military equipment and debt. And there is no offer of development anywhere in the world, Latin America, Asia, Africa. The only thing that they're selling is debt and more ways of entangling in military equipment and so on. Whereas China was offering and is offering huge development projects that are about 10 times the scale of the Marshall Plan at the end of World War II. It's huge. And that is threatening to U.S. economic, political, strategic dominance. The U.S. also uses by sanctions a way of literally destroying targeted countries around the world. And the economic sanctions force countries to shut down. Literally, they can't even import basic medical and food supplies and pesticides and fertilizers, the most basic things, chlorine for purifying water, basic things, and hyperinflation. That's U.S. policy around the world, whereas China's offer of development is so different from sanctions. The U.S. now sanctions a third of the population of the world, 39 countries. So when you look at that and what it means, as more and more countries realize that if they cross U.S. policy in the smallest way, they're threatened with sanctions. And on the other hand, countries realize throughout Africa, throughout Asia, they can get very low interest, long-term vast development projects of infrastructure and industry and trade that's never been offered in the whole history of colonialism and neocolonialism over 200, 300 years of capitalist development. So something radically different is happening in the world, and it is threatening to the U.S. and to the European Union and to all the imperialist powers.
Kim and Mary, do you want to jump in with something?
I just wanted to extend a thank you to Sara Flounders for joining us. I also wanted for, virtually from the East Coast so that we can social distance and educate ourselves. So thank you. I also wanted to let our folks on Facebook, I've got to my left here, our Facebook page for and I can see that people have joined the conversation, and I want to encourage people in that I can see that you are watching, but I want to encourage people to leave questions, because then I could raise your questions to Sara for you. And so I just wanted to give people a heads up about that you might not know, that we would be willing to voice your questions for you. I also I wanted to piggyback off of what Sara Flounders was just talking about, and to sort of see if you could highlight a little bit about what type of solidarity China is showing countries around the world that is fighting this virus. Because the U.S., of course, has turned down any type of cooperation with China. The U.S. is instead, through Donald Trump, chose to just demonize and say incredibly racist things, which has led to an increase in hate crimes against Asian Americans in our own country. But if you could talk about the role of solidarity from China around this virus, in addition, I think that would be helpful for our listeners.
Great, thank you. And really thank you to WHAM, Women Against Military Madness. I known you for 30 years and
That's
always
right.
been in the forefront on difficult questions and in a very cohesive way. So thank you to WHAM for hosting this webinar today. Really, what China has done in terms of its development is so radically different. And can you repeat the end part of your question? Because
what examples of solidarity China
solidarity,
has with countries around the virus?
Right.
You talked about pre-virus and what a great job they've done in terms of solidarity internationally, but I think also around the virus itself, they've done some great acts.
Well, I think one of the clearest examples is in Iran, where actually the U.S. has used this as an opportunity to intensify the sanctions on Iran and even the conscious barring of certain basic medical supplies that Iran has used to develop. Iran had a national health plan, but its medicines are technically put together in Iran, but they are imported. So during this time, the U.S. has shut that down, despite appeals internationally to loosen the sanctions. And on the other hand, China right away rushed respirators, ventilators, and medicine to Iran. Now that's huge. They did it actually in another country too, where Italy thought that they would get help from the European Union. I mean, they assumed it, and yet nothing was forthcoming. Every country in Europe is suddenly only looking for its own population, wasn't able to give anything, and yet China is giving a great deal. And that's going to make a long-term impact. It's also true in Spain. You can see this exchange going on where Cuba, with the interferon drugs and antiviral drugs, immediately shared and sent quantities to China to be used. Here in the U.S., it's how to privatize and how to speculate. This recent expose that Senator Burr, Republican of North Carolina, but also Senator Dianne Feinstein, Democrat of California, what were they doing? They were getting secret intelligence briefings and using it to sell their stock before the crash. And at the same time, putting forth how well prepared the U.S. was. You can see these two interviews that were put forth by Senator Burr, a secret one to his cronies, saying this is a desperate situation, and then his public explanation where he's saying it's all in hand, no worry, we're really able to deal with this. This is criminal. This is really criminal conduct. And yet, China during this time is both alerting the world daily, their reports on what medicines they were finding, their sequencing of the DNA within a week of this virus even appearing is just extraordinary. And the quarantine 2 weeks later of entire provinces, and here it is, more than, we're going into the third month, and the U.S. has just this week. Here in New Jersey, they're saying that 1.5 million people will likely have this virus very soon. One of the hardest hit areas is New York, New Jersey, because it's major port and communication with the world, and no measures were taken until just now.
Well, I guess to follow up with that question, or that answer, what are the measures that China is taking to prevent the reemergence of the illness?
Well, right. Yeah, okay. The big thing they did was this quarantine, both in the province as a whole, in the city of Wuhan, and then in Hubei as a whole, and then beyond. And to actually cancel, which is a big thing in China, the Lunar Festival. This is really the one holiday when people go home, they look forward to all year, huge celebrations. So canceling that was, pretty incredible, like canceling Christmas, New Year's, and the Super Bowl here or something like that. But they did that for the health of the population. They're now heading back to work, ending the quarantine in a very staggered way and continuing the health monitoring. Because while there are no new cases right now in China at this moment, of course, a virus can again flare up. And so the continual monitoring, but you see the images of Chinese medical staff finally returning home. But each one, even as they return home, are being tested, temperatures, monitoring. And the testing in China was humongous. I mean, here we are, actually other countries, even not only China, are doing 20,000 tests a day, and there have not yet been a total of 20,000 tests in the U.S. So we have no idea how large this problem really is or how long it has been very seriously impacting us.
You were in China last year.
Yeah.
What were your impressions?
Well, it was such a different time, I must say. But it was, for me, an extraordinary event. We went for the 70th anniversary celebrations, which the whole country, of course, was in a celebratory mood at that time. The 70th anniversary of the Chinese Revolution. And it was a time to sort of recap the accomplishments in China, which are huge. I mean, the largest healthcare system on the entire planet exists for whole coverage of everyone. But what we saw also was the most modern cities you can imagine. And it did make everything here in New York and Jersey City look like 100 years old. The decaying infrastructure, the subways that are filthy and hardly run, and the homeless here. And to see no homeless in China was absolutely staggering on city streets and parks and gathering places. To see in the last, I think 8 years, 20 different subway lines in Beijing and 16 in Shanghai. This means hundreds of subway stops, and each of them is magnificent, with escalators and elevators, every single subway stop with clean 24-hour access bathrooms. I mean, that's amazing. By any U.S. standard, certainly any New York City standard. And this is true on almost every couple of blocks. Modern, clean bathrooms, sanitation is at such a much higher level. The quantities of new housing, we took also not only subways and most bus lines now are electric buses. It makes the city quieter. You can be in the most densely packed city, and yet the street noise is so much less, just because of electric buses and cars, and less chaotic, a movement of people. People with new housing. I mean, young people, where it seems impossible today for millennials, for younger generation to ever expect to have their own home, their own apartment, and yet this is now taken for granted in China. So anyway, we traveled all around on the bullet trains, on the subways, on the buses, and were extremely impressed. The same thing in restaurants, in food markets, and all of that. Day-to-day life was what we were most interested in seeing and what we were most impressed with.
I have a question that's been text messaged to me. I want to also encourage people that they can post their questions on the WHAM Facebook page, which I am also looking at as well. This activist is from a local Japanese American anti-war activist. His name is Kent Mori, and he knows that you work in New York City, and he was wondering if you could talk about anti-Asian racist attacks that have happened against Chinese Americans and other Asians, because obviously, especially for those of us who've been doing work around, Islamophobia and how that relates to our wars in the Middle East. Similarly, like the demonization of China is also leading to, anti-Asian racism and attacks. But we were wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Certainly. The one undercurrent that it doesn't even take a scratch for it to flame up is racism in the U.S. It is behind everything. And so the very first day of reporting on the virus, it led to an immediate escalation in anti-Chinese racism and anti-Asian racism. It led to attacks on subways and on streets here. I mean, really ugly. But it also comes from the highest level, when you have Trump insisting on calling this a China virus, as if any nationality, any people could claim to have a virus. I mean, it's just so, but it's intentionally racist, and that needs to be confronted. And it is very, very much like the immediate uptick in anti-Muslim racism, the way they could just turn it on overnight and have all the media, and then of course the right-wing talk shows and all of those programs know that they have free, unlimited access to spread even worse. It impacted Chinese restaurants severely, and any Asian-owned business immediately felt the heat of that racism. And it's important to stand up to it and to call it out. So that's a very important question, because it's not even undercover in the USA. It's the go-to immediately by a capitalist system that exists by creating division. And in any crisis, they have to run and find a new way of dividing people. Now, it had already been escalating through the trade war and through the constant demonization of China as a country in the period before. But with the virus, it was to suddenly make everyone feel somehow personally threatened by someone Asian. I mean, that is pretty staggering. And it does need to be both confronted and called out.
Another question that I got texted to me is from Wyatt Miller. He asks, why do U.S. journalists still demonize China even when China's played such a positive role in developing programs to fight COVID-19?
Well, the journalists of the major media don't decide the news angle, don't decide what's covered. They really work for the largest corporations that are completely tied into the banks and the military corporations. And their role is to sell war and racism and to make the U.S. as a system and the two-party stranglehold, both imperialist parties here, seem like the only possibility. So, of course, they follow the script. And I've even had experiences where, let's say I'm doing it, I remember doing an interview, this is several years back, but on a program, and the two commentators were asking me the most offensive, outrageous questions. Then after the program was over, they called me over and asked some very honest questions. And I said, well, why didn't you ask any of that on camera? They said, oh, we just read the questions that are put in front of us on the teleprompter. So they had no say. In other words, they were just playing the role of actors. They didn't decide the questions that they would be asking or the way it was slanted or even the camera angles to show things in a favorable or in a completely unfavorable angle. And that is certainly what's being done in a time of crisis now. And all the journalists know it. They know if they ask too sharp or too embarrassing a question, they'll simply be barred from the next briefing. And that is, in fact, what happens.
Kim, do you want to ask a question? Otherwise, I have another question.
Go ahead, Meredith.
Okay. This one is from Ann Kierstead. She's a member of Women Against Military Madness. How does the Chinese government use its money differently than the U.S. when so much goes to the military?
Well, see now, we could look at this in 68%, I think, of tax dollars at this point go to the military. It's probably even higher than that. But this is the biggest expenditure, and war is the greatest source of profit. Now, in a system that's driven only by profit and maximizing profit, then war plays a big, big role. In a system which is based on human need, it's entirely a different dynamic. Now, there is capitalism in China. There are millionaires and even billionaires. And this is a policy that began in 1979 when China opened up to the world, and they carved a space for both Western corporations to come in and for a certain number of Chinese capitalists to develop who could deal with the West. And that was in big part their role. But when it comes to really important questions, you see who makes the decisions. And the state is really based on the Chinese Revolution, is based on a communist party that is its base of both popular support, but its economic base is in collective and nationalized ownership, which is today the majority of production in China is nationalized corporations. They don't immediately collapse if they don't maximize profit every single quarter. I mean, this is the strain that U.S. capitalist corporations are under, and every CEO knows it. If they don't maximize profit that quarter, they're going under. They're being replaced. It's enormous pressure that only profit decides. And China has a very different system where it has utilized a certain level of capitalist production. That's dangerous, not for it, but you can understand its role and but it is in a controlled way. And at the same time, what has been strengthened step by step is collective nationalized ownership, and not only on a national level, on state, on province levels, there's all sorts of collective ownership agreements in China today. Very, very interesting levels of different kinds of cooperative ownership.
We have a question here on Facebook from Mary Bodwin. She's the WHAM newsletter editor. She asks, can you address the U.S. withdrawing from the INF Treaty over the objections of China?
Excuse me, which treaty?
The INF Treaty. Says, can you address the U.S. withdrawing from the INF Treaty over the objections of China?
I'm sorry, I don't know which.
Here, arms treaty. Mary, text something. What you mean?
Okay, we can go on to another question.
Okay, all right, and come back to that, okay, because
yes. So
I don't want to answer the wrong way. There's lots of initials.
Mary will provide some. We'll come back to Mary. This question is from Tracy Malm. She asks, what can we do in this time of quarantine to attack the anti-Asian attacks?
Well, this is a time when we're all reduced to social media, I think. And I think one thing that's very helpful to do, and I've seen a lot, is people circulating news directly from China. And that is one way of people becoming more used to what another whole part of the world is saying. I think that's one small way of doing it. I think another way is to counter the Trump message. We're calling this a China virus. Those are small ways. Certainly this webinar is another way. That the more information people have and the more they're engaged in discussion, that's important, because in isolation, things can feed on their own fear. And whenever there is social communication and discussion, it breaks that down. And so I think that's a very important thing. And I've been very excited the way political activists almost immediately began thinking, all right, how do we utilize where we got to all stay, at least 6 feet apart. Social distancing is important. How do we still operate as political people and as conscious socialists, seeking to really show that cooperation and collective action are possible in a time when we're all being told, stay in your own little space and don't talk to anyone? Well, we're finding ways to talk.
Mm-hmm. So here's an interesting question. You noted that China has a lot of billionaires. So does the U.S. But what makes the Chinese billionaires different from the U.S.'s billionaires?
A good point. In the U.S., the billionaires decide everything, not only in the U.S., but globally. I mean, really, it's a handful of multi-billionaires who own more than half the population of the world. And they decide life on what will maximize their profit. And it's a ruthless system. This is a good time to talk about, when we're talking about the coronavirus, what's the biggest killer in the world today? The number one disease that everyone knows the cure for, everyone on the planet knows the cure for. The number one killer, even the people who are dying from it know what would cure them immediately. Hunger. Hunger kills 25,000 people a day, every day. Amazing, amazing. And when you think about it, even for a minute, capitalism could solve this problem overnight, but they don't. They actually seek to exacerbate it everywhere. How can they, through sanctions, through all different policies, through their trade deals, accentuate? How can they, through the IMF, through the World Bank, get countries to do away with food subsidies? How can they increase hunger? It's a weapon to them. And yet the very first step that any socialist country, or even a country with a popular revolutionary change, even if they haven't, you can't say it's a socialist country yet, but the first step they take is to alleviate, is to do away with hunger, because it's a big killer.
Mm-hmm.
And yet capitalism uses hunger. So that's a big difference between the two. We can see it in healthcare now, we can see it in modernization, we can see it in technology. But the big thing is the oldest human scourge. Starvation is hunger. And for thousands of years, there wasn't enough. So it was based on who had the most power, who could eat and propagate. But really, for the past 100 years, hunger is totally solvable. And in this age of globalized economy, completely solvable. And yet 25,000 people a day die of hunger. That's a capitalist crime.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Sarah. I was going to give a little bit of background about what the INF is. If we want to go back to that question, I looked it up a little bit.
Thank you.
So I'll give a little bit of what I found, but Sarah, if you are still not familiar with it, we can just skip over it. But I thought I'd give a little bit of information. That it is the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty.
Oh.
So that required the U.S.
You were saying IMF.
Oh yeah. Do you know then if it's the INF? Do you want me to give background, or do you just want to answer?
Well, no. Go on.
Okay.
Go on, and then I'll.
So that required the U.S. and the Soviet Union to eliminate and permanently forswear all of their nuclear and conventional ground-launched ballistic and cruise missiles with ranges of 500 to 5,500 kilometers. It marked the first time that the superpowers had agreed on reducing their nuclear arsenals. But on October 20th, 2018, Donald Trump announced his intention to terminate the INF treaty, citing Russian noncompliance and concerns about Russia's intermediate range missile arsenal. And it looked like Russia had been concerned that the treaty focuses on them, but their neighbor is able to produce these things. And then on the 20th is when October 20th is when Trump said those things, and on December 4th, Mike Pompeo announced that Russia was in material breach of the treaty, so that would suspend its obligations for 60 days if Russia did not return to compliance. And then on February 2nd, 2019, the Trump administration declared a suspension of U.S. obligations under the INF treaty.
And thank you for reading that. Yeah. I did think you were saying IMF, so I was thinking the International Monetary Fund. So, the nuclear treaty it really shows, first of all, the U.S. never abides by any treaty it's ever written with anyone, including hundreds of treaties with indigenous people right here. They violate every treaty. They violated also the Iran nuclear deal, which was signed with all the big powers of the world, and just completely ripped it up. But the violating this treaty showed that there was a new escalation, and a very dangerous escalation, because NATO now extends right to the borders of Russia. And so it's a level of threat that is directed directly at Russia, but it's directed, of course, in this age at the whole world. It would end life on this planet, any kind of a nuclear exchange at all. And it shows how even agreements that are reached, whether it is on basics like climate, agreements that are reached with other countries, or the nuclear, there was a powerful movement demanding these nuclear treaties that had a very powerful impact in the 1980s in the U.S. Millions of people marched, campaigned on this. And finally, there was an accord reached. So taking that freeze off is a further way to escalate military spending in a big way, modernizing the whole, And by the way, at the same time that they're doing that, the U.S. was planning war games in Europe that were only just the last 3 days downscaled, but they were going to send 30,000 additional U.S. forces to Europe to operate with NATO forces throughout Europe in war games. Now, this is not games. These are really deadly threats, every single one of them. And the largest ones were to be right on the border with Russia. They were sending a very clear message. And by the way, that doesn't stop even during this time when we're all in shutdown. The building of these weapons goes right on forward. So I think it just shows they don't honor any treaty, any agreement that they've made, just like they never honor a labor contract as soon as it can be revoked, broken. They'll go for it. That's the way they do business. And it's the way they do business with war.
We have a question here from Lucia. She's a member of both the WAM board and the Mideast Committee. Lucia says, apparently the Chinese government has apologized to the family of Dr. Li Wenliang, who had been reprimanded for warning about the outbreak early on. I don't know if, from what she said, if she wanted you to comment on that. And then the second part, she also had posted, do you think that letters and calls to the White House would get Trump to stop calling it the quote unquote Chinese virus?
Well, first of all, in terms of the apology, and it does show in China, they're willing to immediately, if an apology should be made, make an apology. But at the same time, the doctor who released this, it was not at all in his specialty. There was a whole team who was dealing with this within the first days. And we should recognize that before anyone had died of the COVID-19 virus, 44 people were sick. China had already released, sequenced the DNA and released a report to the World Health Organization on a dangerous new virus that caused pneumonia. So what to do with it yet was a question. And how to operate with it. It's very important, though, that what was being called for by medical people in China was immediately responded to. And that is, they were saying immediate quarantine. That's what this doctor was saying. And that is what medical people said and were listened to. Now, in the U.S., we wonder how many medical people in hospitals will die because they don't have any equipment. Really, they don't have gloves, they don't have masks in medical centers. Even some of the people doing the swabs don't have the equipment that they should have. So I think it shows that China was responsive, and yet there's always a lag time, even of days, that people at the same time feel they should speak out. They did speak out, and China acknowledged that. In other words, this is somebody who wasn't demonized. That's important. Should people, by the way, contact the White House? Absolutely. Yeah, sure. I don't know. It's not going to change Trump. We shouldn't have any illusions about that. And yet, at the same time, we should denounce racism in every way that we can, and denounce it also in the media, and say, how dare you repeat this? Bleep it over. They can do that, just like you would an obscenity. If Trump raises an obscenity or a racist attack, they should just boop. Supposedly we can't say fuck online, but here's an obscenity that they should be bleeping out.
Yeah.
Well, that just shows the stark contrast between China's leaders and the leader here, is that he kept calling it a democratic hoax perpetrated, and so he wasn't believing it, and people die more of the flu, so what's the big deal? So that definitely shows that the leaders here in this country they don't care about the interests of people themselves. Otherwise, in China, they do. So, I mean, of course, everyone makes mistakes, but they're owning up to it. And they've done such a great job of curtailing this virus and coming out with cures or somewhat to kind of help slow down this. But other than that, the U.S. just propagates its own egos, and just really puts everyone's health at risk. So that was just a comment.
Well, no. Let me actually follow up with that comment, because see, Trump was speaking in the old way until China showed there's a new way of dealing with this. What was absolutely acceptable, think about it, 2017, 2018, that's 2 years ago, 80,000 deaths in the US from flu. It's acceptable until China said not acceptable. And the swine flu, which was 2009, 2010 season, that originated in the US. No measures were taken. It was actually a virus that impacted primarily the young, and people over 60 seem to have a natural immunity based on an earlier viral strain. US did nothing, and the World Health Organization said that 284,000 people died globally from the unchecked spread of the swine flu, which was an H1N1 virus. So that's the past, treating what's acceptable, deaths, and whether a new way can be shown. And so I think what would have been the U.S. way of dealing with this, had this virus started here, they would have said, like they said 2 years ago, well, it was a heavy flu season. Lots of people died. And it takes them 2 and 3 years sometimes to even come forward with the numbers. And we don't know how accurate the numbers are. And they might be higher yet. So anyway, these are the things I think it's valuable to contrast. And I do think this is changing the way we see sickness on a global scale, that China took measures and they publicized the measures to the whole world in broadcasts, what they were doing, what the count was, what measures they were taking to protect people, the thousands of medical teams that were coming in, the hospitals that were being built. Now, that made a big impact. And it made a big impact even in Italy, which is a country which has the highest rate of tourism, the largest number of tourists in the world, actually the largest number of tourists from China also, and was hit hard by this new virus, but it is challenged. They have a more rudimentary and not as, it's certainly capitalism still reigns supreme in Italy, but there is a national health plan, but one that was found to be totally inadequate for dealing with casualties like this. And belatedly, really belatedly, the whole country was put on quarantine. Even after that, the US still didn't go and create any quarantine. So we're late on every level, even based on other countries in Europe who were late also in dealing with this. And yet the attacks, even today, you'll see any coverage of China and they will say, oh, China was slow in dealing with this. Why it took them 10 days. How dare they? You know, we're 10 weeks into this.
I have another question that's been sent to me, and I just want to encourage our listeners that they can post questions on Women Against Military Madness. There's a pinned thread where this event is. It's called Understanding the U.S. China Conflict with Sara Flounders. And so people are able to post their questions. Okay. This question is from Autumn. She's a local trans anti-war activist, and she asks, in the U.S., some of the biggest difficulties facing the LGBT community, especially youth, are access to stable housing, healthcare, education, and employment. Do China's approaches to basic human needs mitigate issues like this? There you go.
Well, absolutely. It goes a long, long way, and yet it has to keep going further. The LGBTQ question, even within China, is developing socially in many ways, and we should both applaud what is being done in housing for all and healthcare for all, and saying always that every form of oppression needs special recognition. Now, here in the U.S., just the lack of healthcare and housing and the high rates of imprisonment and abuse particularly suffered by the LGBTQ community, who are targeted again and again. So we got to take special care, even when we raise demands, on demands that have to do with the most oppressed communities here, migrant communities, people of color, and also the LGBTQ community. To make special demands also, how about healthcare during this time where there are additional and special needs? And they say, well, we're doing away with anything which isn't what they say absolutely essential medicine right now. So there are a lot of questions that should be carefully addressed and supported by the whole movement here.
Sara, before we got online, you were telling us that you really wanted us to raise the question of how can we raise demands in this period? And you told some really exciting stories about the role that progressives have played in terms of solidarity and raising the demands of people who are in prison. So I was wondering if you could address your own question, which was how can people raise demands in this period?
Raising demands is key, and power concedes nothing without a struggle, without demands. That's Frederick Douglass. So this is not new. We can't move forward without absolute demands. We issued in Workers' World 10 demands. I'll just say quickly what they are. I don't have time to, but free health care for all, nationalize the healthcare system under community control, build emergency hospitals. 3 was full pay benefits, guaranteed income for all. 4 was food, housing, medical supplies, utilities, including internet for all. Suspend rent, evictions, mortgages, utility shutoffs, and all debt. 6 was prioritize resources for communities of color, migrant, LGBTQ peoples, seniors, youth, and people with disabilities. There has to be special attention and thought given. Empty the prisons and detention centers. Shut down ICE. End the racist attacks. 8 was community control, no cops, no military. 9 was $2 trillion to the workers, not the banks, because that's how big the immediate bailout was to Wall Street. We should come back to that because we're in the midst of a really global capitalist crisis too. And the last one is end U.S. wars, sanctions, and environmental destruction. Now that's something we put out. I also want to say that Fight Back earlier on put out some very good and strong demands, that a number of organizations came together immediately to make demands about health care, about who should get the bailout. Now, it also energized local activists. The demand to empty the prisons. We put out in New York an immediate call on Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio to close Rikers Island, where overwhelmingly people held there are simply awaiting trial on archaic bail, are people picked up on parole violations and so on. The conditions there are overcrowded, are really dangerous. So that petition, which we issued and other groups issued, really, it seems, is calling for somewhat, not enough, but an emptying of the prisons. We got to demand the same thing for migrants and the detention centers. These are become a death sentence in the crowded conditions. So making these demands online and immediate calls and phone-ins, it does get results because they're feeling weak and vulnerable. And their system is fragile right now, just like the demands for immediate paychecks. It's amazing what they can give when they feel the pressure, the heat. Now, it is to keep their own capitalist system going. It's to keep the landlords and the banks and mortgage payments. They're willing to actually give people some money. It's kind of staggering. We'll see who actually gets this, but at least now, verbally, they're saying they're going to give on some of these things. So the more we demand, and the more we demand it for everyone, including those who never get counted. How about the unemployed? And we also want to escalate and publicize actions where, for example, homeless people took unused housing in Los Angeles. They just moved into it. We should publicize things like that because it's people themselves acting. And it has forced in California, they're actually moving homeless people who were in tents for miles sometimes. I mean, if you look at Los Angeles, you look at San Francisco, the number of people who camp on the streets. So putting these people in basic housing that they always had a right to is a very important demand. And we got to think about that and exchange the information even more, because the more we demand, the more we can win. And it's a time when unions also are demanding. So some of the AFL-CIO unions are making strong demands on what city and state and medical workers have a right to on the job, and a right to the sick pay and full benefits. So at any rate, these are very important times when even the unions can finally find their voice, which they won't unless they're pushed by their own membership.
I think that leads into a good question for us to think about as the anti-war movement. Right now, across the country, people wanted to have events that were talking about how sanctions kill and really trying to highlight the situation internationally with the sanctions. But yet most of the events, if not all the events that were scheduled throughout the country, had to be canceled because it's really not responsible at this point to get that many people together. Additionally, some places were having educational events, but other places were having protests. Meanwhile, the U.S. not only has continued sanctions on these 39 countries, like you mentioned, but the U.S. has actually increased its pressure campaign on Iran, which is disgusting when you think about the fact that Iran is one of the countries hardest hit. And so I guess that the next question I wanted to ask is sort of looking at that there have been political wins, which I think is impressive in this time period where people are facing incredible difficulties and people are trapped at home. We're being forced to work jobs that are incredibly dangerous. I think it's really impressive that we've had victories. But thinking about that within that context, what can we do as the anti-war movement? Because I feel like we have a political responsibility to our sisters and brothers in places like Iran, Venezuela, et cetera, to really use this as a moment to say sanctions are always wrong, but sanctions during a pandemic are like absolutely horrendous. And so I want to sort of ask the question of how can we, get people to take political action, but in a way that doesn't tell people to stop social distancing.
All right, how to be really socially responsible, and yet at the same time, we're not going to stop. Now, last weekend, we had been building, it looked very strong, a demonstration on Wall Street saying sanctions kill, and a lot of participation from every group that had focused on sanctions on Korea, on Iran, on Venezuela, on Cuba, on Zimbabwe, on half the sanctioned countries are in Africa. So how could we really focus attention, and yet we had to stop and say, no, we can't go ahead with this demonstration. What we were able to do is in Oakland, they were planning a meeting, also an indoor meeting. They moved that into a national webinar. And there were thousands of viewers on Facebook, on the Zoom link, had all kinds of shares. And it was done on less than 24 hours notice. And there were speakers talking about the impact of sanctions on Haiti, on Zimbabwe, on Iran, on Korea, on so many different countries. So it was refusing to be silenced, figuring out how to spread the message, and also how to escalate the message, because this is a time when it really does fit to say that sanctions exacerbate and spread this virus, because depriving medicine at any time, just like depriving food, is really a crime against humanity. This is a time I think people can more hear that. And, it's only when healthcare suddenly you can picture being without it, or that there are not enough hospital beds. And in the US, there's almost twice as many hospital beds in China, and quite a number of other countries than the US has here. So these figures become more real, and I think it's an important time when we've got to really pick up again on the sanctions campaign, and do it through many different new forms, and do it in a wider way. Because people have lots of time at home right now, so they're either going to be drowning in anxiety, or they're going to be doing all kinds of educational and political struggle.
Well, I think you've been talking for an hour. I don't mean you've been talking for an hour, but this program has been going on for an hour, which is very generous of you to do this. And so in light of needing to do stuff, maybe we should wrap this up so we can get busy doing the work that needs to be done. And unless there's something else you'd like to say before we end.
We do have one question about the Uyghurs, and we haven't addressed them yet.
Okay.
Does everybody have time to do that?
I do.
That's fine.
So this question asks, can you talk about the U.S. idea of humanitarian intervention regarding the Uyghurs? And humanitarian definitely has quote marks around.
Right. There is no such thing as a U.S. humanitarian intervention. It's a complete contradiction and opposite. Now, in Xinjiang, which borders an area that has suffered so grievously from U.S. wars, 40 years of complete disruption in Afghanistan, which borders, you had the most underdeveloped area of China, and you had a conscious U.S. policy to recruit Uyghurs from outside of China and bring them, they're a Turkish minority, bring them to Turkey. They became a real basis even of ISIS. There are more than 10,000 Uyghurs fighting in Syria. Picture that, from China. How did that happen? That was a big recruiting drive. And at the same time, the National Endowment for Democracy set up and kept going and funded it with millions of dollars, major offices in Washington, D.C., supposedly for Uyghur human rights. Now, China very much realized the problem, and the problem of underdevelopment and a rural people where most of the development in China had been on the eastern and coastal and most populated areas of China. So they chose a policy of rapid both education and, as they said, re-education of training in skills. Now, it's entirely different from the U.S., quote, war on terror. Look what the U.S. policy was in Afghanistan. Massive bombing of the whole country and never building one damn school. I mean, not schools, not hospitals, not skill training. It was really how to use one nationality, and of which there are 100 in Afghanistan, against another in U.S. alliances. So China chose an opposite road. They said, let's have rapid both skill and educational training and modernization of the cities. And what had been going on widely in other parts of China, the most rural and isolated areas, it had not yet happened, and they moved that up. Now, that was directly against U.S. plans, which were how to divide and pull apart China, how to take one grouping from outside China and see if they couldn't use it against and to dismember China. Now, they did this with all the people of Eastern Europe in an earlier time. They did it extensively in Yugoslavia, where you take whole groups of people and they're educated, funded, financed here, and then they're used in the breakup, certainly in the breakup of the Soviet Union. So that was their plan for China. They're very frustrated that it did not go according to plan. When there have been many studies done, or you could look up what I've written online on this, but talking about, and certainly Gray Zone has done extensive, well-researched, they really put online the amount of funding these different Uyghur organizations based in Washington, D.C. get, the mercenary camps that were established, the groups that were used by ISIS in Syria and based in Turkey. All of this is now online, and it's worth us really knowing this is how sinister. When they target a country, they don't just target it in one way. Hybrid war in this day and age means economic and political and social means, and going at it from every angle. How can they pull something apart and shred it? So they did this extensively in Hong Kong, where you had, a city that was a direct British colony for 150 years, and then returned to Chinese sovereignty, but with capitalist rules in existence. That's how it happened in Hong Kong. They wanted to use that also as a way of dividing China, and felt that people in Hong Kong could rip apart, could begin to shred confidence in China. Didn't work out for them, but it does show each of these plans take place at the same time as the trade wars were going on and the military encirclement. And it's part of the same plan of the U.S. of warfare, of constant war on every level. There's 18 major national intelligence agencies. They all have all different agendas. I'm probably I know I'm going off on this too long, but it's very connected, and it's well worth people doing the research. You have time now of really looking into this question and the way in which U.S. imperialism uses war and division and racism and separation all over the world. That's the only way they can stay in existence, is exacerbating national tensions everywhere they can. And that's true whether it's in Afghanistan. You look what they did in Iraq, where suddenly people were divided by religion, ethnic background. Suddenly it's even stamped on their passports. It's what's decided in every government ministry and every budget allocation. It's to divide people. It was the way they operated the war in Syria, where by group, could they possibly exacerbate the differences in a country that was the most multinational, multi-ethnic, small country in the world, Syria. And so in combating it, Syria had to combat it in a joint way. Now, you might say, what's the combination here? But it's how the U.S. fights a war and how countries respond then to U.S. war threats. A progressive social formation can only use solidarity. And solidarity is a weapon. Solidarity is a weapon in the class struggle. Consciously building unity. It's a weapon. And the capitalist weapon is division. Mm-hmm. It's creating and exacerbating religious, ethnic, and national differences. So I think as when we see that we have a weapon of unity, we're actually much stronger and further along.
Thank you.
Yeah, that definitely shows that. That's for sure.
You might have noticed that Sarah Martin disappeared. Her connection dropped, and we've tried to get her back, and it's not working. So maybe that does help signal it's a good time for us to wrap up. We actually have gotten a fair amount of questions and interactions from our viewing audience, which is really great because sometimes that doesn't happen. So thank you, everybody who's been watching and commenting. And I just wanted to encourage everybody else on this video, since we didn't get to every comment and question, if since we're all kind of stuck inside right now, if you have some time today, maybe go back and look at some of the comments or questions and answer something that we didn't get to answer on the video, or just interact with those a little bit. It looks like Sara is now watching the live stream, and she says thank you to Sara Flounders. So
well, thank you very much to Wham. And by the way, all these streams keep going. So if anyone missed it now, it can go out again and again, and it's really how we keep the conversation going.
Yes.
So thank you.
Something to also kind of maybe follow up, it would be another good live stream to go through. But after the crisis is over, I mean, we've seen such solidarity work amongst the people in the U.S. The people pretty much have learned to take things into their own hands to make sure everyone is well taken care of. So I think the main question now is, after the crisis is over, are we as Americans going to go back to our old ways where we're letting the capitalists rule the country? Or do I dare say we actually get more unified to actually bring to bear, like really to bring to bear items that we really need to have as a working people, as a working class?
That's right.
No,
that's the best thought, because this is a huge development. It will profoundly radicalize people. It will change their thinking. When something this traumatic happens, and unless we're out there with a voice as strong as we can make it, then there's only the voice of the corporate media. But it will radicalize it. I mean, Trump has never looked more weaker, more ineffective. And of course, Biden, they have no solution for this. They really don't. So I think it is a very, very important time for us. And we should have big confidence.
We in the Anti-War Committee want to thank both Sara Flounders and Wham for letting me be a part of this conversation today. I do think it's important to try to experiment with new methods of outreach and communication, because we're not going to be able to take people to the next, to the next level when this crisis is done if we haven't done our work in this period. And so I want to say thank you to both Wham and Sara Flounders for helping sort of like use this Saturday as an opportunity for political education, as opposed to just an opportunity for people being isolated. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yes, hopefully you'll be seeing more things like this. This is kind of a newer format for Wham, but it's something that I've been trying to increase myself. So I was like, hey, Wham, we can still do this event. So hopefully we'll be doing this some more, and everybody will, all of our other organizations, because, everybody needs information right now, and everybody's just sitting at home looking for it. So we have to, like you said, Meredith, we have to do that work now so that we can kind of catch everybody once this is done, because everybody's going to be kind of falling and chaotic. Where do I go from here? What's going on? And we have the time to do the work now, because most people don't have any other work to do, unfortunately. So thank you, everybody, for participating.
And let's keep reaching out, by the way, to all those who get forgotten. The homeless, the migrants, the prisoners, and people who are packed, into little tiny apartments and all of that. Let's really be reaching out. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Definitely.
Okay,
Bye.
signing off.
Bye. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.